Hello, we're delighted to welcome you to another episode of It's Not That Simple from the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation. Today, we are at the beautiful Casa da Música, the House of Music in the north of Portugal, in Porto, to meet with our star guest. He is General David Petraeus. Welcome. We are going to discuss and try to break down one of the most relevant, most pertinent topics in the world today, which is war and peace and where we stand as a planet, as human beings entering another decade very soon. Of course, as you may know, General David Petraeus is a former US general with a long career in the military, 37 years. Of course, you were commander in a war in Afghanistan, also in Iraq, director of the CIA, also an author. You had a best-selling book that was very successful, Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, that was published late last year. I could go on talking about your CV, which is indeed illustrious, but I wanted to get into the number one topic really that everybody is discussing today when it comes to the state of play in geopolitical tensions around the world. We are living in a complicated time. We've got wars raging across two continents, many other conflicts emerging. We've got terrible war in Ukraine, also, of course, in the Middle East. General, when you look at the state of play today, how concerned are you about global warfare?
Very concerned. First of all, thanks for being my interrogator, my interviewer here, Pedro, and thanks to the Foundation for the invitation to be with you. I think it's important to put this in context. I actually left government over 11 years ago. Since then, I've been with one of the world's largest investment firms, KKR. I chair and I established the KKR Global Institute, which does the geopolitical risk analysis for any of the deals where that is important, and it has become increasingly important. And that's quite simply because the world has transformed during that 11-year period from one that could be described as benign globalization, in which economics largely drove geopolitics, in which the barriers to trade, capital flows, investment, data flows were all being reduced, were all going down, and global trade was going like that. 11 years later, the world has seen seismic change. Geopolitics is back in a big way, with a vengeance, in fact. Now geopolitics increasingly drives economics. Now those barriers that I mentioned that were all being reduced before have all been going up, and we're going to see even more of that because we're in for a number of various tariffs of various types as the US, the EU, other major economies around the world are increasingly concerned about China exporting its, quote, overcapacity. You just saw the US put huge tariffs on electric vehicles coming from China that were heavily subsidized. So you're going to see much, much more protectionism. You'll see much more industrial policy, and you'll see other limits, again, on where we can invest and also how they can export and so on. So now, globalization has become slowbalization. It's almost flat or sometimes up and down. And in many respects, within it, there is regionalization, all these major themes that have evolved from the return of geopolitics. In fact, I contend that today, the US, its allies, the Western world, if you will, faces more challenges in number and more complex challenges than at any time, I'd actually argue since World War II, but certainly at least since the end of the Cold War. If you think of us as the guy in the circus who keeps a lot of plate spinning on sticks, rushing around, and the US is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here, but so are all of our allies and partners. There are more plates in that tent, and some of them represent more complex problems than at any time in the past. The US and Western relationship with China is the biggest, most important plate in that tent, bigger than all the others put together. Can't let that wobble if we can avoid it. But there's a much more menacing Russia plate. There's still a North Korea nuclear plate. Iran, perhaps represented by 3 plates. Its nuclear program, its support to malign Shia and even Sunni, in the case of Hamas, militias in the region. And then it's its drone and missile program, which has expanded so substantially. There are still individual Islamist extremist organizations that you have to keep an eye and pressure on, or what happens is what happens when we withdrew our final combat forces from Iraq. The Prime Minister pursued sectarian actions. The security forces took their eye off the Islamic State, which we had destroyed during the surge in Iraq, which I was privileged to command, and kept down for the subsequent 3.5 years. And all of a sudden, 2 years later, you have the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate in modern history. And there's a number of other organizations like that, extremist groups, again, that are increasingly concerning. There are various cyber threats, whether they come from nation states, criminal entities, extremist groups, you name it, there's all of those. There are manifestations of climate change that are ever more worrisome. You know, the storm of the century seems to be every other year now. Wildfires have never been as destructive. Desertification is causing mass migration, especially, of course, into Europe, and especially the southern part of Europe on the Mediterranean. And I could go on. There's populism in various countries that is very concerning, including to some degree in the United States. So think about all of those different plates. Think about the effort required to keep them all spinning. And I didn't even really talk about all the conflicts that are in the Middle East, which I'm sure we'll get to as well. So that's the world in which we find ourselves. And I learned as a four-star general and as a director of the CIA that you have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be. And the way it is right now is fairly fraught. There are lots and lots of threats. I believe that it's absolutely in our cold, hard national interest in the United States and in the interest of the other countries that hold the values and principles and so forth dear that we all do together to do everything we can to maintain the rules-based international order, which has actually been very good for us, not just in security terms, but also, frankly, in terms of our economies, and again, a world that allows our systems to continue to operate.
Wow, you did really well to set the stage and set the table for this conversation.
This is what I do for a living, after all. I also teach, by the way. In fact, I teach a course on great power competition. A graduate seminar at Yale is my academic endeavor right now.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning from you during this conversation, because it's so clear that it is so complex, and taking into account all the different spinning plates, it's important to have someone or the right people spinning those plates, right? So we've got obviously a big day coming up with the US elections. How much?
Many months off still. It's quite a long period of time. A lot can happen.
Okay, true, but still, how much does world peace and the ability to spin those plates correctly depend on the outcome of that election?
It's certainly a factor. If Biden wins re-election, that you'll have a degree of continuity that you might not have with President Trump returning to the White House, but that's not actually clear. That depends on who is around him. It depends on his individual relationship with individual leaders. Some leaders worked much more effectively with him in his previous term than did others. Depends, frankly, on whether Europeans continue to step up to the plate and spend 2% of GDP on defense and help Ukraine. It's your continent after all, this kind of thing. So again, I think there's a number of factors that will actually determine, if he is elected, what the policies are. And certainly there are some areas in which there could be, again, the reversion to perhaps America first, although we saw that play out last time. And I used to always caution people and say, yep, read the tweets, listen to the sound bites, but then follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the policy. And by and large, the policy on Europe and NATO in particular, despite the harsh criticism at times of certain countries in particular, but the most important country is actually now spending 2% of GDP on defense, and that is Germany, which just recently became the number 3 economy in the world. So you've had the Zeitenwende here. So again, I hate to lay out, all these, I'm going to say it depends a lot for 2 reasons. One is that I used to teach economics, and the answer to every question is always it depends, and then you lay out the factors. But the other reason is, frankly, because it really does depend. I mean, if you ask me what's going to happen in Ukraine, I will answer it depends. It depends on continued U.S. assistance. We now have that. $61 billion is a staggering sum of money. It's $11 billion more than the entire EU contribution of $50 billion. It's all in security. And it's even almost $20 billion more than we provided in the first 2 years of the war, which was very substantial, $44 billion. It depends also, though, on Ukraine getting its forced generation processes cranked into high gear. They had a very emotional debate in their rota in the parliament over the conscription law. You know, they have a very different concept from our systems. In the two wars that I was privileged to command at the top level, Iraq and Afghanistan, the average age of a soldier on the front lines is roughly 19 to 22. The average age in Ukraine is 42 or 43. And it's because they conscript much later. They believe young men should be able to finish their education, get married, start a family, and then it used to be at the age of 27, they're first eligible for conscription. They have reduced that to 25, that's good, but now they've got to get the process going and all the rest of this. And because there's been so much displacement to try to find all those who are now eligible for conscription, crank up the training base, all the rest of this. So that's a huge issue. It depends on the relative ability of Russia to continue to generate forces and replacements and soldiers, noting that, of course, however impressive President Zelensky's strategic leadership may have been, and strategic leaders have to perform 4 tasks. They have to get the big ideas right, the strategy. They have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and all stakeholders. They have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas, and then they have to determine how to refine the big ideas and do it again and again and again. And think about it, his first big idea is, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to fight for Kyiv. We're not going to give up our country, and on and on. However impressive that has been, and of course his communication skills are exceptional. He was, after all, an actor. In fact, he was a comedian who played the president so effectively to get elected president. And then his example, energy, inspiration, all these in tasks of overseeing the implementation. You know, he's never worn a suit since day one. He put on some form of military uniform, goes to the front lines in contrast to Putin, who's at the end of a long marble table. So again, all very, very impressive. But there's a reality here, and that reality is that Russia has a population that's much more than 3 times the size of Ukraine's, and probably even more than that, given the individuals who have left Ukraine. And then you have an economy in Russia that's at least 10 times the size of Ukraine's as well. So this very, very challenging. It depends on relative technological advances on either side. Look at what the Ukrainians did, for example, with their maritime and air drones and anti-ship missiles. They've sunk over 1/3 of the ships of the Black Sea Fleet of Russia. They've forced Russia to withdraw from the Western Black Sea, including the centuries-old port of Sevastopol in Western Crimea, which means now that the Ukrainians can export grain, which is really important for their fiscal situation. It's also important for Egypt's food security. That's 25% of the world's grain exports. So you see what technology can do. They're each racing with each other to use these unmanned systems of various types in the battlefield, on the front lines. The Ukrainians in particular, because they want to send machines, not men, given the disadvantage that they're at in that regard. They're producing tens of thousands of drones per month. And you're seeing there, by the way, hints of the future of conflict. Ironically, or paradoxically, though, Ukraine has been described correctly by Max Boot, one of the great Washington Post writers, as the war in which all quiet on the Western Front, of course, a World War I reference. Meets Blade Runner. You know, you've got World War I style trenches, dugouts, barbed wire, concertina wire, use of CS gas by the Russians, miles deep minefields and so forth. But then right on top of them, where you have Cold War era armored systems and so forth with improvements trying to breach these minefields, right on top of them you have drones. And the drones can send the coordinate digitally back to the Fire Direction Center, which puts it on the guns, and you have very accurate fire within a very short period of time. So again, it's almost a hybrid warfare in that regard in terms of old and new. And so all these different dynamics, continued European support is very important as well, and the Europeans have been stepping up to the plate. And Trump can perhaps claim some credit for that, although every US president that I ever soldiered for was critical of Europeans for not enough of them spending 2% of GDP on defense.
But how sustainable is it to keep up this support
It's very sustainable. Yeah, no, it's very sustainable. We can do this. We can keep all these different plates spinning. In fact, we have to. Think about it. If the most important dynamic is the relationship between the US, the West, and China, what are we trying to do there? Well, we're trying to deter conflict. Deterrence is a function of 2 elements. One is the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities. The other is the assessment of your willingness to use those capabilities. And if you can't even sustain or support a partner who is fighting a common enemy, who is carrying out the first invasion of a neighboring country in Europe since World War II, what does that say about your willingness to use your forces in the Indo-Pacific? Frankly, I thought that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I argued against, I said publicly we would come to regret, and I believe we have. It's a horrific outcome, and predicted that if we pulled out, that the Afghan forces at some point were going to sustain a psychological collapse. I think that undermined deterrence. In fact, President Xi seized on it. He said, hey, all you first island countries, look at that. U.S. is not a trustworthy partner or ally. And by the way, look at how it went. They're a great power in decline. Now, I don't agree with either of those, and I think we have responded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine probably much more substantially than Putin thought. He was probably influenced by Afghanistan as well. Nonetheless, you have to make sure there's no question you don't want to be needlessly provocative, but you don't want any doubts in the eyes of a potential adversary about your willingness to employ the forces that you have. And you need to transform those forces, which is what it is we're doing in the Indo-Pacific. We're hardening bases, we're putting headquarters underground, we're dispersing the forces, we're improving the defenses, shoring up our alliances, Philippines, Japan and Korea working together, all of these different actions, the Quad and so forth. Those are all very, very important because, again, the most important task in the world is to ensure that this relationship that the U.S. National Security Advisor has described as severe competition does not become severe confrontation.
I want to get into China in a moment. First, however, we need to address the situation in the Middle East. It's obvious that the U.S. position in the war in Ukraine and Russia is to support Ukraine. Obviously, Israel has been a longtime partner and ally of the U.S., but how long do you think that can happen for, and will it always be there regardless of what the behavior and the attitude of the IDF is in the war in Gaza and the atrocities?
I think it's generally going to always be there. There are certain dynamics in American society that will lead us to do that. That said, and by the way, I've been in Ukraine 3 times in the last year, including, I guess it was 5 or 6 weeks ago, and then I was in Israel also around that time. And I have a relationship with the Minister of Defense and with others. And I have talked to them and said publicly as well that while I do believe that Hamas does need to be destroyed, I equate Hamas to the Islamic State. It's not reconcilable. It is an Islamist extremist army that cannot be reconciled. We did reconcile in Iraq, as you may recall. We reconciled with 103,000 former Sunni insurgents, lower ranking, and Shia militia, but not with the irreconcilables. They have to be detained or they have to be killed if they don't go into detention. So destruction, by the way, as a military doctrinal term, means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. Again, I believe they do need to be destroyed. I believe that they can never be allowed to rule Gaza again or to govern Gaza. And of course, you got to get the hostages back. The problem is that how you do this matters enormously. That's number one. And in that regard, their campaign design is inadequate. They're essentially going into areas in Gaza, destroying the battalions. Again, there's about 24 battalions to begin with. They're down to about 19 or 20. The rest have been temporarily destroyed. The problem is that they are clearing and leaving, which is what we did before the surge in Iraq, and it's very ephemeral. Yep, you destroyed that unit, you rendered it incapable of accomplishing its mission, but you did not prevent it from reconstituting. And if that's the case, it will reconstitute. And we've seen they had to go back into Al-Shifa Hospital, which they should have held on to and made into the greatest medical center in the Middle East to take care of the people who were caught in the crossfire. They've had to go back twice into northern Gaza. And so the idea is that they need to add 2 other elements. And essentially, they need to conduct a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, just like what we did in Iraq, noting that the context is different in a number of ways, and it's fiendishly more challenging given 350 miles of tunnel, an enemy who uses civilians as human shields, holds over 100 hostages, and all the rest of this, and knows the neighborhood far better than Al-Qaeda in Iraq ever did in Ramadi, Fallujah, Mosul, and so on. That said, the construct, the campaign design, I think inescapably has to be clear, hold, and build, or they will never really accomplish their mission in a sustained or sustainable manner. And what I mean here is that you do, first of all, first and foremost, you announce before an operation, we are going to destroy Hamas. We're going to then make life better for the Palestinian people in Gaza. And here's how we're going to do it. Once we get Hamas out of your neighborhood, we're going to create a gated community. We did 12 of these, I think it was, in Fallujah. You have an entry control point into it. Biometric ID cards, so you know who's who and who can go in and out. Bomb-sniffing dogs, X-ray machines, and everything else. You flood these areas with humanitarian assistance so they show you are making life better. You gradually work with local partners. There's clans in there that some of whom can be incorporated into helping in this regard. They're not going to love the Israelis the way the Arabs, Sunni Arabs, eventually came to love the Americans as they saw that we were really improving their lives. But again, you at least get them to avoid fighting you. And then you start to rebuild.
But this, sorry to interrupt, this hasn't really been done, though.
We did it in Iraq.
Right, but the Israelis are not really following this.
And this is the challenge, not at all.
Right.
No, and despite
Exactly.
counsel, despite suggestions, no question. And there's a number of reasons for this we should understand. One is the trauma that the Israelis sustained. We lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. This would be the equivalent for us, what the Israelis suffered, of 42,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage. So just think about that. This is the worst day in the history of Israel. And that has rendered the Israelis, in many cases, finding it difficult to differentiate between Hamas and innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Even the Minister of Defense said this was going to be a scorched earth campaign early on in this campaign. And I know him and have enormous respect. He's an old soldier, old comrade. So that's first. Then the second is that they've never done a counterinsurgency campaign. All of their urban operations are essentially punitive. You go in and you strike something, you destroy a headquarters or something, and then you pull back out. In the past, there's no field manual for it, there's no training. By the way, it took us years to figure this out in Iraq.
I'm sure.
In fact, it was on I had 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, only one was not in combat. And that's the one where we wrote the counterinsurgency field manual, did all these other work, overhauled every aspect of preparation of our forces, leaders, organizations, equipment, and everything else for Iraq and Afghanistan. It made a huge difference. Because again, we had to learn how to do this. And of course, at the end of the day, it's a conscript army. It's not the kind of long-tenured professional force that we had as well. There are spectacular capabilities resident in it, and extraordinary initiative and brains and technology and everything else. But this just takes boots on the ground. And you have to conduct the operations in a way that does not sow the seeds of Hamas 2.0.
Which you were very careful to do in Iraq.
We were very, very careful about that. First of all, we took the Geneva Convention and laws of land warfare very, very seriously. We had very strict rules of engagement based on those. But then I had a sign on the wall in these, again, I have 5 combat commands as a general officer. The sign was staring me in the face asking, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, in other words, it's going to create more bad guys, you're supposed to go back and figure out how you get to yes. If you can't get to yes, you go sit under a tree until the thought passes, was the way we phrased this. Now, this is a fiendishly more difficult situation. You have the tunnels that complicate everything because at some point you have to use some pretty substantial munitions. They work very hard to get the civilians out of the way with text messages, leaflets, loudspeakers, you name it. Some civilians just won't leave. Then you're in the dilemma of what is the military necessity here versus the potential collateral damage. These are tough issues, and I'm very loath to sort of second guess from afar. But clearly, the damage and destruction has been very substantial, and the loss of innocent life, regardless of whose metrics you use in the arguments over how many of these are actually Hamas, et cetera, has still been quite significant. So how you do this, first of all, getting the campaign design right, then actually executing the clear operations, which are where that's the kinetic component. Then how do you keep the neighborhoods secure, gated community? We built miles and miles of cement wall every night. we didn't build the walls, we just slung the walls. Somebody else is building them. You put them on low buoys, you have cranes, you put it. That's how you keep these communities free of, in our case, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became the Islamic State, but also the Shia militia in certain areas as well. So there's all these tactics, techniques, and procedures. Then you get biometric ID cards and all the rest of this. Yeah. This is very challenging stuff. But if you don't do this, you're going to have to keep going back into these areas. Now, you might hermetically seal Gaza, which they are. They now control the Rafah crossing as well. And so you're whittling down Hamas, but in the meantime, it's pretty chaotic inside Gaza, not just the humanitarian challenges that exist there and the constant pushing around of the displaced people, but also who's actually providing security, if you will, or who's in charge. And it's a mix. There are literally criminal groups. In some cases, there are clans that actually might do a reasonable job, remnants of Hamas, and of course, the minute the Israelis leave, Hamas is going to start to reconstitute. So you've got to clear, hold, build, and if this is not done, you're just not going to achieve the results that they want, and again, that I'd like to see them achieve, noting that how they do it really does matter.
How concerned are you that the longer this conflict goes on, for the higher the probabilities are for involvement or further involvement from Iran, from Lebanon, and that the situation could then also escalate and impact supply chains in the Red Sea?
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Middle East is that unless there is a reduction in the supply of crude oil, natural gas, and distillates coming out of the Gulf, it has very little effect on the global economy. There's no great supply chains in these areas. Certainly, Israel is a technological superpower, startup nation, and so forth. But at the end of the day, that's not akin to disrupting the China supply chain to the US and the EU during the pandemic. Yes, it takes 12 or more, give or take, days if you have to go around Africa instead of through the Suez Canal. Yes, Egypt is very concerned because they're losing 60% of the revenue that they normally get from ships transiting the Suez Canal. But again, by and large, the markets price that in very quickly, and it's really all about the flow of crude, natural gas, and distillates out of the Gulf. And here's the irony. Iran exports 1.5 million barrels of oil and distillates a day. They're not going to interfere with freedom of navigation in the Gulf. Obviously, the other countries don't want to interfere with it. And frankly, the US is not going to put sanctions on Iran in an election year where the price of the gasoline pump is a big factor in inflation. So if you understand the dynamics here, I just don't see it affecting. Now, that doesn't mean that the conflict is not very concerning. It doesn't mean there's not possibilities of escalation. But frankly, Hezbollah, the Iranian-supported Shia militia army, really, in southern Lebanon, they're limiting themselves both in the numbers of attacks they do per day and the distance that they're doing these. And so it's 13 attacks or so, 8 to 13, something like that. Israelis are responding in kind, sometimes going a bit deeper after some of the leaders or something like this. But again, okay, that's not a full-fledged war. Now we'll see what happens because Israel does want to push Hezbollah north of the Litani River, which would get certain of the more ubiquitous rocket launchers and so forth out of range of Israel so that they can move tens of thousands of Israelis who used to live in the northern part of the country and have had to be evacuated, just as they've evacuated tens of thousands from the south. So that's a dynamic presence. Certainly the Iranian-supported Shia militia, many of them from Iraq, carry out individual attacks. The Houthis, as I mentioned, but we're actually grinding the Houthis down. You're not seeing as many attacks in the Red Sea. What's really interesting about the Red Sea is that this is the first naval combat, real naval combat, something more than the little tanker wars that we had in the Gulf some decades ago. Real combat since World War II, if you think about it. I mean, they're getting really shot at, and they are defending themselves, and they're shooting back. And this is quite an interesting, and again, technology will leap forward during this kind of event because the importance of combating the drones, so counter unmanned aerial systems, CUAS, is really big right now. And I think we'll see some breakthroughs. We're going to see high-powered microwave make its appearance on the battlefield. I should acknowledge I'm a personal investor in what I think is the best high-powered microwave system. It's publicly known that it's the Army, U.S. Army is deploying it to the to that region, I think it's going to prove very impressive. And you're seeing, again, technological advances in Ukraine and also to a degree in Russia that are also very impressive. In fact, Russia's electronic warfare, which has always been one of their strengths, is actually reducing the effectiveness of some of the precision munitions the U.S. has provided. And so we're having to retool those and having to figure out how we deal with that. And Ukraine is doing the same on their side. Ukraine even has remote-controlled machine guns now. The problem is they can't figure out how to reload them remotely or how to fix a stoppage. But the advances are quite significant. But again, to come back, does this really affect the global economy? Not necessarily. What's going on in the Middle East, though, does reaffirm what we used to call the CENTCOM truths. There's 3 of these. The first is that Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens there doesn't stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees in some cases, all the way into our European allies.
Yeah.
Second is that you've really got to know who your friends are and who your enemies are. And Iran is our enemy, and we should never confuse it for anything else. Israel and others, the Gulf states and so forth, are our friends. And then the third is that we need to understand that these efforts to try to leave the Middle East, which we do periodically, we have the pivot to Asia, we have this, we draw down. When I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, the whole region, which is from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north, Yemen and the pirate-infested waters off Somalia in the south, we had 250,000 men and women in uniform alone, and another 250,000 or more contractors as well. It's vastly reduced from that time, and it should be. But the effort, at a certain point, you need to recognize there's a certain threshold presence that is required, and stop trying to leave, because leaving the Middle East for the United States is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in.
You mentioned at the top of our conversation that China was definitely the biggest plate that had to be spun.
Without question. Largest trading partner for about 120 countries around the world's manufacturing colossus, although some of that is shifting because of a variety of dynamics, including recognition that you shouldn't have all your manufacturing and assembly done in one part of one country, especially if there's a zero COVID and you're making Apple iPhones. So where are they building the new factories? India. So and then there's rising labor costs there. There's problems, concerns about supply chain security, dual use technologies, all of this, and the restrictions on what we can sell them and what they can buy with us. All of these are much newer, if you will, and are the factors that have transformed the world from, again, benign globalization to renewed great power rivalries.
So how difficult will it be, how challenging will it be to keep that trade partner aligned in any way when it no longer makes a secret out of backing Putin and his efforts in Ukraine, when it cannot align politically and maybe even when you consider the geopolitical forces at play in various conflicts around the world? How do you keep trading with them? How do you keep aligning with them in having that interaction and when it can continue to be morally sound or not?
Well, first of all, you can't decouple. You can de-risk to varying degrees, but they can't decouple from us. We depend almost entirely on China for certain critical minerals, strategics, process. Again, it's an enormous dependence. They're our third largest trading partner, right after, as always, our 2 North American neighbors. But they also have a pretty big dependence on us. Without what we sell them, they can't feed their people, and they can't feed their livestock. So there's a dual dependency. This is two ways, absolutely. It would be great if we could all recognize, can't we all just get along and have a more mutually beneficial relationship? But right now, it's a very competitive, severe competition, as Jake Sullivan has described it. What you want to do is, again, make sure that doesn't break into real conflict. And the way you do that is you talk, you have military-to-military ties. Keep in mind, when that Chinese intelligence balloon floated over the United States before we shot it down, the Pentagon picked up the hotline and nobody answered in Beijing. That's not good. That's dangerous. And so, again, that's what you have at play here. You've got to talk. You've got to establish guardrails, a floor to the relationship, all the rest of this. And we've been doing quite a bit of that, especially since President Biden and President Xi met outside San Francisco during the big summit.
When you have a look at all the conflicts that are occurring in the world today, taking into account your extensive experience on the ground, which one worries you the most?
Well, actually, again, I would come back to the importance of deterrence of, again, conflict with China. That's what matters most. Then after that, probably Ukraine, because it's such a profound threat to the, if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he's not stopping there. This is a guy who, when he was asked what was the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, a century that, of course, had 2 world wars and a Great Depression, among others, he said the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That gives you an insight into how he thinks. And he's been trying to reassemble as much of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire or whatever as he can. Pretty limited success so far. Belarus, I guess, really, and he's sort of lost Armenia now to a considerable degree. Lost the Central Asian states. Again, they still have relationships and ties, but it's not remotely what it is that he'd like it to be. But if he succeeds in Ukraine, Moldova is next. In fact, Moldova has a very important election coming up, and we need to do everything we can to help them, help this government to show that they're the right choice for the people rather than the opposition, which will turn east rather than west. And we've seen a little bit of that, of course, in Eastern Europe as well. Then he would go after Lithuania probably, or one or more of the Baltic states, and now you're into a Russia-NATO conflict, and that's very, very serious, obviously.
Fortunately, here in Portugal, we're not really dragged in to any of these conflicts. We're a pretty neutral country, peace-abiding country, but as you sit here today and we're here on Portuguese territory, what message do you have for a country like Portugal, for young people here, for Europeans, when it comes to the role that we can play as a country and as a continent, as Europe, as EU, in maintaining some kind of deterrence from serious conflict and warfare?
Well, I mean, frankly, it should be everything that country can possibly do, especially when you have a situation like Ukraine. Yes, you'll say, well, what we do really, does it really matter? It does, absolutely. It's not just the political effect. There is a physical component to this. There's good forces here. I've soldiered with Portuguese and all the NATO countries, obviously. I think the coalition in Afghanistan was something like 60 to 65 countries. And some of those are pretty small. I remember there was one prime minister and minister of defense and chief of defense staff that were visiting me, and I realized I was giving him more minutes of my time than he was giving us soldiers from his small country. That's okay. Coalitions matter. I think Churchill had it right when he said that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And you need every member of that coalition. It does matter. And I would never sell yourself short in that regard. There's lots and lots of ways in which to contribute. And of course, it's the cumulative effort, especially when it comes to sustaining, again, the values and principles that we hold dear, which have generally served our countries and the world. Might find some different opinions on that in the global south, but generally has served certainly our interests very well and kept the world largely safe for the practice of democracy and free market capitalism.
Before we get into our quick fire section in the show that we have with all our guests, I didn't want to let this opportunity to have this conversation with you pass without asking you about Afghanistan quickly, and if there's anything that can be done to deter the Taliban rule and to have some kind of progress, whether that's socially, culturally, economically in that country.
I'm pretty pessimistic about Afghanistan. I mean, it's turned out the way a number of us feared it would, including now the fact that there is an Islamist extremist organization that is using the inadequate security conditions, actually fighting the Taliban. This is the Islamic State Khorasan group, and Khorasan is generally a broad region that extends beyond Afghanistan and all around in the region. And of course, it's that group that carried out that horrific attack in Moscow. Yes, we have intelligence on this. Yes, we were able, for example, to get the leader of al-Qaeda. Remember, the Taliban agreed they would not allow international extremists back into their country. And not that long after they took control of Kabul, you'll recall there was a drone strike from the U.S. that killed the leader of al-Qaeda there, the successor to Osama bin Laden, who we got during the final months that I was commanding in Afghanistan, our special ops under CIA control. And here he is, a couple of blocks from the presidential palace in a building controlled by the Taliban. So, and the fact is they have done what we feared they would do, which is take the country back in time to an ultra-conservative 8th or 9th century interpretation of Islam that denies 50% of the population the opportunity to go to high school, much less college. And, you know, I was a big supporter of the American University of Afghanistan. In fact, my wife and I had put a scholarship every year for a woman to go to the American University there. And of course, now they're going to the American University, but it's in Qatar or Albania or Sulaymaniyah, Iraq. So it's tragic to see this. Again, we didn't go into Afghanistan to give women's rights, but it was sure a wonderful benefit of what did take place. And it's tragic to see the efforts of 20 years go up in smoke, basically. The problem was a lot of people didn't understand that the defense strategy for Afghanistan, which was inescapable, it's the only possible one you could have, is to have marginally trained and equipped police and soldiers protecting the urban area, the major urban areas and the critical infrastructure. And then when they're hit by the Taliban, the 35,000 strong, highly trained, motivated, equipped commandos who are around the country in key locations get on helicopters and go out and come to the rescue, essentially. And it worked quite well for a long period of time until we had insisted, after my time, in selling them overly sophisticated American helicopters by American, Black Hawks, very, very powerful, very capable, but very difficult to maintain. So then we had 17,000 mechanics or maintenance people, largely from the West, on the ground. So the critical withdrawal was actually not the 3,500 US troops, which we could have sustained forever. We hadn't even had a loss of a soldier in the final year and a half until the tragic suicide bombing at Abbey Gate. But the real challenge was how do they maintain the helicopters because the 17,000 couldn't stay once we left. And so you had this almost bizarre effort to try to maintain the helicopters using FaceTime from Qatar with translators talking to these sort of inadequately trained Afghan maintainers. And the operational readiness degraded very quickly. Of course, they're also getting shot at and all the rest of this. And then we'd forced the Afghan government in that terrible diplomatic agreement that we signed with the Taliban to release 5,500 Taliban members, who of course went right back to fighting and enabled the Taliban to conduct multiple offensives at one time, which they could no longer respond to. The minute the soldiers knew no one was coming to the rescue, as I mentioned earlier, it was predictable there would be a psychological collapse. So we are now where we are. The Taliban are not responding to any kind of inducements. They are implacable. The economy has largely collapsed. And at least half the country, again, can't do anything really productive. And half of the country is also starving. And you see it because they're voting with their feet and trying to get out if they can.
General, we're going to finish our conversation with the quick fire round. So a handful of questions where I would appreciate just a one word or one sentence answer. The first one is, what is one good personality trait that an exemplary leader could benefit from having?
Determination, I think. There's an old adage that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And you have to really commit to preparation. You have to have a lifetime of study, be serious about it. You can never, nobody wants to be led by someone who is proud to be average. You can't lead from the rear of the formation, all of this kind of stuff. So it's really about being really determined, self-disciplined, self-aware, so that you are constantly preparing for the challenges that may come down. I mean, a lot of people said, look, Petraeus was lucky. First he got command of the 101st Airborne Division during the invasion. And, just for a couple of months, it could have been the other guy. And then, he gets called back to do this. And then, lo and behold, he's called on to command the surge. And just because you know timing or whatever, well, not entirely. I mean, they call your number because they think you can perform. And the more desperate they get, the more willing they're willing to call your number. So I think, again, this determination, or maybe just it is a fierce desire to be the very best you can be, while also being the best team player that you can be.
That was a really long sentence, but
It
I'll let
was.
it go.
It was. I've filibustered my way out of a lot of situations over the years.
What is the biggest challenge that humanity is facing today?
God, there's a lot to pick from, I think. There's a number of them. Again, this is not one where you can say the biggest. I mean, again, it depends on the moment. Obviously, the various conflicts around the world, the various challenges around the world, manifestations of climate change.
Yeah, we get that a lot.
All these different, I'd say the wealth inequality, differences between the North and the global South, all of these issues, I think, are enormous challenges, and there still is extremism of various forms, some of it domestic as well as Islamist and so on. So there's no end of challenges. And I guess, in the US, there's a degree of partisanship that we think is unique. We've actually had some pretty partisan moments in the past. One of them was a civil war. But there's quite a bit of partisanship right now. And we saw that on Capitol Hill. It delayed it's actually dynamics that delayed the House of Representatives, because we had a bipartisan majority in both houses. It was just the dynamic that one person could take down the speaker, which is a really foolish agreement.
If you could change one thing, if I gave you a magic wand now, you could change one thing about the planet right now, what would that be?
World peace.
I know it sounds like a Miss America pageant, right? But it is true. It is really what
Sure.
the big worry is.
Can't we all just get along?
Yeah.
Can't we live and let live?
Finally, what is the most important learning of your life and career?
The intellectual construct I laid out for you for strategic leadership. It's a model. I developed it between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq. I used it explicitly during the surge in Iraq for the first time, constantly thinking of getting the big ideas right, communicating them effectively, overseeing their implementation. There's all kinds of sub-tasks here in each one of these. And then formally sitting down, determining how you need to refine it so you do it again and again. And the truth is, it applies in the business world as well. I'm, again, a partner in one of the world's largest investment firms. And this is one of the ways we evaluate companies. Are the strategic leaders capable, or the strategic leader, oftentimes, the CEO? I mean, it works in the civilian world as well. And I'd very quickly go through Netflix with you. Reed Hastings, one of the great strategic leaders in the world, his first big idea is put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, so they're going to undersell Blockbuster. Blockbuster's largely gone out of business except for one place in a contrarian community in Oregon, which is great because people of my age can take our grandkids there and show them what we used to do on our Friday night.
I didn't know they still had one.
Movies. There's one there and there's one in Alaska. Then the second big idea, he recognized that the context has changed, so you can have a new big idea, which is they can download movies. Third big idea is the real breakout moment, make our own content, $100 million in House of Cards alone and all these other iconic series. And then the fourth big idea is make major motion pictures. And he goes out and buys not one, but 2 major movie studios. He does so well, Metric is part of the overseeing the implementation. He gets more Academy Award nominations 3 years ago than any other major studio. There is one issue that I'll finish our conversation with, and I addressed it with him. I've talked about this intellectual construct. And that is the movie in which Brad Pitt played my very close battlefield comrade, General Stan McChrystal, who commanded our Special Operations Forces for 5 years and then was the commander in Afghanistan when I was his boss at Central Command, and then I replaced him. And I said, Brad Pitt just did not get Stan McChrystal. He's very wooden, sort of stiff, salute awkwardly, never cracked a smile, had no sense of humor. But beyond that, I said, I couldn't believe that Brad Pitt didn't hold out to play me.
It's never too late.
Yeah, that's right. We're gonna have a movie on the surge.
General David Petraeus, an absolute pleasure, privilege. Thank you so much for sharing your encyclopedic knowledge of some of the world's most relevant and crucial topics when it comes to war and peace. I think you definitely, I don't know if you painted a pretty picture.
Well, it's not a pretty picture.
Exactly. But
it's a fraught picture.
Yeah, but you definitely helped us understand why.
Thanks for guiding it nicely.
Yeah, you helped us understand why it's not that simple. So thank you so much.
Privilege. Thanks. you.